Hello and good morning from the cruel, brutal, capitalist dystopia of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day. Because if you're having an amazing day, why, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, you should also be having an amazing day. Before we start today's video, I'd like to draw your attention to a critical matter. Now, a couple of people from the Party Socialist Malaysia were arrested by our Malaysian government. Pakatan Harapan have basically treated our Socialist Party as criminals for the crime of defending the rights of people not to be evicted from their own lands. So, some of you might still be wondering about what my politics are, and yes, I am a left-winger, but I am taking a sabbatical from the Socialist Party for a few months because right now I need to focus on the more personal, cultural and civilizational aspects of my life, because I realize just how critically endangered my Baba Nyonya culture really is. And it's virtually extinct in Singapore. That's why I'm actually taking a break. I don't want to burden the Socialist Party with identity politics. So I've temporarily resigned from the Socialist Party of Malaysia, but I still think they are the most principled, honest and just-minded party in all of Malaysia. So yes, although I cannot support them with every fiber of my being, in the sense that not that I don't support their goals of an egalitarian socialist Malaysia. At the same time, I know that right now my focus is right now on the civilizational survival of my Baba Nyonya culture. So that's why I would just be a burden if I were to join them, and I could not be as productive as I would be if I didn't, if I were to join them. So, but still, I do think they're the only honest party in Parliament, and this is not a propaganda video. You're free to vote for any party you want. I still do support the Socialists, and I will still vote for them in the coming election, and I will still promote their ideals of a just and fair society. So I'm not for a revolution. I don't agree with a revolution. Everybody in the Socialist Party, virtually all of them, do not support an armed revolution. However, yes, I do want Malaysians to be more aware of this party. Perhaps you can contribute more to it than I can right now, because right now I'm fighting for my own existential survival. So on my channel I talk a lot about my Baba Nyonya heritage, and I am aware that many people in the West are still a little bit confused as to who the Baba and Nyonya people are. Now, the Baba and Nyonya people are basically a subgroup of the Peranakan people, who are basically a Creole people that resulted of mixed marriages between Chinese, Indian and Middle Eastern people with the local ladies of the land, creating a mixed hybrid identity that is not emotionally anchored in the so-called foreign ancestral land. Now, I prefer, personally, when describing myself, I prefer Baba and Nyonya to Peranakan. I don't really like the Peranakan term to describe myself, because Peranakan is too broad and generic a category. In Singapore, Peranakan has basically been twisted to mean anybody with one Nyonya ancestor who may or may not practice the Baba Nyonya culture or hold the Baba Nyonya worldview. So you see just how easily the title Peranakan can get hijacked. Because in Indonesia, any Chinese fellow who marries an Indonesian ethnic woman can call his children Peranakan, whether their children identify with Southeast Asia or not. So that's how you have people like, for example, Lee Kuan Yew's father, Lee Chin-kun, who probably had no native ancestry himself, calling himself an Indonesian Peranakan, even if he himself had no identification whatsoever with Southeast Asia. And so I much prefer the term Baba and Nyonya. Now, many Westerners are still not familiar with who the Babas and Nyonyas are. The Babas and Nyonyas are distinct from the Han Chinese late arrival people, in the sense that our ancestors came throughout the 15th to 18th centuries, and they basically married local ethnic women, whether that be Indonesian or Malay or Siamese women, and they created a Creole culture that was a mix between China and Southeast Asia. Now in Malacca there are the Chetty Peranakans, who are not Babas and Nyonyas, but they're basically a combination between Tamil people who came here hundreds of years ago and married into the soil in the same way our Baba Nyonya ancestors did. So my friend, Mr. Thiru, is an economics teacher at Kingsley International School, and he describes how he's often judged and criticized unfairly by Tamil people in Malaysia because he doesn't speak Tamil and he's never cared to learn. So to them, it seems to them that he has shirked on his ancestral obligations, when in reality he's just being himself. Doesn't, in the same way, you know, you see a lot of Chinese ultra diasporoids who haven't left the boat mentally, who are still bashing me for not being Chinese enough, for not identifying enough with the Chinese heritage. You know, it's like being at a different stage of civilization from a third or fourth generation Malaysian Chinese. The Baba Nyonya is fundamentally someone who has transgressed the need for Chinese community approval. Now, generally speaking, Baba refers to the male Chinese-descended Peranakans, while Nyonya or Nyonya refers to the female Chinese-descended Peranakans. I'm not sure if there's a gendered term for the Chetties or the Jawi Peranakans, but for the Babas and Nyonyas, those are the terms we use for ourselves. Or we might call each other Aba and Anya. Yes, these are also affectionate terms. Now, basically the creation of the Babas and Nyonyas was due to a historical accident. When I say a historical accident, I'm not referring to something that occurred unintentionally. Okay, fine, you could say it occurred unintentionally. Legend has it that the first wave of Baba Nyonya people were descended from the Chinese sailors who came with Admiral Zheng He to the Kingdom of Malacca in the 15th century and stayed on and married local women. Now, this, of course, is unverified by history because we don't have any Baba Nyonya artifacts that have survived from before the 19th century. So we don't know for sure if this origin story is true or fabricated. But what we do know is that if we go to Bukit China or Chinese Hill in Malacca, where I took my cousin to get in touch with her Baba Nyonya heritage, my cousin's Australian, there are Chinese graves that date all the way back to the 1600s. Now, most Malaysian Chinese date their arrival back to the 19th and early 20th centuries. So the historical graves on Bukit China are evidence that there were Chinese sailors and merchants coming to Nusantara even before the 19th century. Like I tell my enemies, my ancestor came here willingly, while your ancestor came here kicking and screaming. He didn't want to leave China, but he had to because of the century of humiliation, while my ancestor came here and chose Nusantara as his home. Anyway, I say it's a historical accident because these chaps who came here in the 15th to the 18th centuries did not get to bring women along with them. They didn't get to bring their wives and children. And that's why I say that I might have ancestors. Oh, sorry, of course I have ancestors in China, but I might have long lost relatives in China that I don't know and I will never know, because the link to China was lost after my ancestor came here hundreds of years ago. Now, the point is that doesn't really matter because China is a distant memory to me. My origin story starts in Nusantara. But in the time of the Ming dynasty and the early Qing dynasty, Chinese women were not permitted to leave China. Because if you think about it biologically, women are more biologically valuable than men. Okay, let me give you an analogy to try and explain why the Chinese emperors did not allow Chinese women to leave China. But they told the men you could go wherever you want, we don't care. However, you cannot reproduce a civilization if you have 10 men and 1 woman. But you can reproduce a civilization with 1 man and 10 women. Does that make sense? So men were biologically less valuable for the reproduction of the Chinese people. There wasn't a Chinese people, strictly speaking, in those times, but men were seen as less biologically valuable in those days. I'm not trying to get into the red pill stuff. So men who might have found it difficult to find a wife, or who might have found the constraints of the Confucian hierarchy too suffocating, decided, okay, this land isn't for us. China doesn't suit us very much. We're going to go somewhere else and make a better life on greener pastures. So these brave sailormen ventured forth into the unknown. They ended up in Nusantara, and they found that life in Nusantara was much better than life in China, because even if it wasn't perfect, at least you were treated not as a cog in the Confucian bureaucracy. You weren't treated as a cog in the machine, because back then you didn't have any value if you lived in imperial China unless you were a Confucian scholar. That's why families would hedge all their bets on their children passing the imperial exam to become mandarins, because, well, you were either a mandarin or you were worthless in the eyes of the Confucian bureaucracy. Now, it's supposed to be a meritocracy, of course, but there's like maybe a 10% success rate or less. So basically, yes, I'm not calling my ancestors losers back home, but what I am saying is that they left a cruel, dog-eat-dog and heartless society and ended up in Nusantara. Now, in Nusantara, of course, the Sultan is the boss, right? However, the Sultan did not treat you as merely a cog in the machine. You were treated as a human being, because he still gave you a piece of land and he still gave you a future, at least. So what do you do when you're a foreign man in a foreign soil without any of your China connections or clan halls? Well, you simply adapt, and that's what the ancestors of the Baba Nyonyas did. They learned Malay, they married local women, and essentially they did not look back to China as an ancestral land, even if they might have kept certain Chinese cultural practices. In the same way, some migrants who might not intend to go back to their so-called homeland may keep certain cultural practices, even if they assimilate to the land. And that's exactly what my ancestors did. So when they built Cheng Hun Teng Temple in the 17th century, the ancestors of the Malacca Babas were not trying to reproduce China in Nusantara, but rather they were holding on to a religion and to a custom that was valuable to them. So they did not completely erase everything from their Chinese world. However, the caveat here is that they did not cut and paste the Chinese way and the Chinese norms over here in Nusantara. The food of the Baba Nyonyas is primarily a combination between Chinese and Southeast Asian food. Basically, you have dishes such as otak otak, which is a fish custard that's made with egg, and curry kapitan, which is basically a dish of chicken curry. And legend has it that the first person to eat curry kapitan was Francis Light, but I'm not sure about that. You have fundamentally dishes like ayam buah keluak, which is a type of chicken dish that's cooked with a poisonous nut that's called a buah keluak, the keluak fruit, but it's more of a nut rather than a fruit, and it's very delicious. The black nut tastes like like blue cheese. Actually, that's the way I see it. And you have also got Chinese named dishes like jihu cha, which is basically fried cuttlefish with shredded. What's the name of that vegetable? Mengkuang. What's the English name for mengkuang? And you also have dishes like a form of dongpo roll known as tao iu bak, which is basically stewed pork with eggs and tofu. Sometimes they put tofu. And you also have dishes like chap chai, which is a mixture of vegetables and tofu, and it's one of my favorite dishes. And as for clothing, the Babas and Nyonyas adopted the clothing of the land. The Nyonya women, whether they be in Malacca, Penang or Singapore, tend to wear the kabaya, the baju kabaya, which is the SIA stewardess uniform, as their casual wear. But for formal events, and we don't see many of these anymore, formal events demand a baju panjang or a long dress. And as you can see, this is my ancestor in a baju panjang. This picture was taken at the turn of the 20th century. So we don't see many baju panjangs anymore. So Nyonya women have a very distinct appearance when it comes to their clothing. The Nyonya hairstyle is known as the sangul, which is basically a very elaborate and tedious hairstyle that's tied in a big bun at the top. Now, Baba men, on the other hand, have far easier expectations. We're not expected to put on elaborate hairstyles. The typical attire of the Baba is a baju lokchuan, which is basically a combination between the Chinese and the Southeast Asian type of clothing. Or in informal events, just like the kabaya, the Baba man wears a sarong, just like any other Southeast Asian man who's culturally Southeast Asian. Now, the food and clothing of the Babas are just two of many things that distinguish us from China. Because when the Singaporean ultra Chinese say to me that you are Chinese whether you like it or not, the Malays and the Peranakans are really two separate groups. Peranakans have always been diaspora Chinese. I want to ask these people, did the kabaya come from China? Did the sarung come from China? Did Baba Malay come from China? Did the karong sang, which is basically like a brooch on the kabaya, did it come from China? Did the sanggul hairstyle come from China? Does the word Peranakan come from China? Heck, most people in China, in fact all people in China, virtually all people in the 19th and even the early 20th century were not aware of the Baba Nyonya people. In fact, most Chinese people had not even been aware of the Baba Nyonya people until Fan Bingbing put on a kabaya to promote Malacca. Then suddenly Baba Nyonya's, you had people who had no interest in our culture who even looked down on the Baba Nyonyas as OCBC, or Orang Cina Bukan Cina, or fake Chinese, or watered down Chinese, suddenly claiming they liked Peranakan culture because Fan Bingbing made it palatable for them. That's why I'm saying that if you truly respect our culture, respect it as it is, not a cynicized version of it. The Baba Nyonyas, after a few generations, eventually stopped calling themselves Chinese and started referring to themselves as Orang Sini, or people from here. Baba Malay, our language, is a Creole fusion between Malay and Hokkien. I mean, Tan Cheng Lock, the founder of the Malayan Chinese Association, Tan Cheng Lock did not speak a word of Chinese dialects. He might have known a couple of Hokkien words because Baba Malay is a Creole language between Malay and Hokkien. So Tan Cheng Lock did not speak Chinese. However, that didn't bother him. If he was feeling a deep sense of anxiety about not being Chinese enough, he could have learned because resources are all over the place, but he didn't feel it was important to get back in touch with his Chinese heritage because, well, that was ancient history to him. Because his ancestor came in the late 18th century, married into the soil, and never looked back to China. But Lim Boon Keng was a totally different story. Lim Boon Keng was the grandson of a late arrival, also known as a Sinke, or a new guest, who married a Penang Nyonya woman. But Lim Boon Keng's Akong did not pass down the Baba Nyonya worldview to his grandson, unfortunately. So fundamentally, Boon Keng, the so-called Peranakan reformer of Singapore, who pushed the Babas to re-sinicize and learn Chinese and get in touch with their Chinese heritage, was not culturally Peranakan. Now, I have to make it clear that being Peranakan is not a blood contract. We don't expect you to stay Peranakan if you don't want to be Peranakan. If you want to identify as Chinese, that is fine. However, what I do not like is people who are non-Peranakans using examples like Lim Boon Keng or Lee Kuan Yew, who had a Nyonya mother, as examples of authentic Peranakans, when Lee Kuan Yew himself said he was technically a Baba but not spiritually one, because he did not identify with the Nusantara worldview. He did not think Nusantara was his civilizational axis. He did not think that the Malay world was really much to shout about, and he considered China to be his civilizational axis. That is fine, but call yourself Chinese and not Baba if you do not consider Nusantara to be your civilizational cradle. So basically, the Babas and Nyonyas wanted a distinction to tell both the British colonial authorities and the Malays that, look, we are different from these late arrivals. We don't have the same culture, we're not fresh off the boat, and we've been here for a long, long time. So yes, the word that I use for my Chinese ultra enemies, who call me a banana and a disgrace to the Chinese race, is Sin K. which basically in the Hokkien language means new guest. Now the assumption was that these people would be back in China when things settled down. But unfortunately things didn't really go according to plan, because after the century of humiliation, basically you had the warlord era, which was basically a power struggle between Sun Yat-sen's successors, or people who wanted to succeed Sun Yat-sen after the creation of the Zhonghua Minzu identity, or the One China identity. And then after that you have the communists take over in the 1950s. So the Malaysian Chinese fundamentally were left stranded. The Sinkays were fundamentally left stranded in Nusantara because they had hinged all their hopes on a rising China in the early 20th century. In fact, some of them, I am very sad to say, donated their entire month's salary to Dr. Sun Yat-sen's Sinhai Revolution, because they believed that a strong China would give them a sense of pride and dignities, that nobody could look down on them anymore. And I appreciate the sentiment, but Babas and Nyonyas, for the most part, are not anchored to China in the sense that whether China is strong or weak, we don't see how it affects our self-esteem, because Nusantara is our civilizational cradle. Whether we are in Malacca or Penang or Singapore, we might speak different dialects. Some of us speak Baba Malay, others may speak Hokkien with a sprinkling of Malay words. However, Nusantara, we can all agree, except for some wayward Peranakans in Singapore, we can all agree that Nusantara is our civilizational cradle. That's a non-negotiable. Now, I don't care whether you're full Baba or Nyonya or half or quarter or 1/8. That doesn't bother me. You know, people say that I'm a racist. They say that I'm a strict, pedantic, fundamentalist gatekeeper, that I'm allowing the culture to die and I'm one of the grave diggers of the culture because I refuse to let it evolve beyond its pure Malacca form. But to tell you the truth, I'm actually quite an open-minded man. Don't listen to my degenerate enemies who say otherwise. I welcome every single Chinese Malaysian with a sincere heart to marry into our families, if they're willing to assimilate into our ways. Now, the thing is, Baba Nyonyas themselves don't have a strict Zhonghua Minzu type of identity. We don't have a Baba Minzu identity in the sense that, for example, the Chinese used to hack each other up for if they came from the wrong dialect group, right? In the past, it was unthinkable for someone from a Cantonese dialect group to marry someone from the Hokkien or Hakka dialect group, and vice versa. But today, they're all just Chinese, because Sun Yat-sen created a sense of national consciousness from what he termed particles of loose sand. Because just 100 over years ago, the Chinese people were divided. They were like particles of loose sand. In the same way, I could say the Babas are like particles of loose sand, because everybody seems to be doing their own thing. Why? Of course, while Malacca is accepted as the gold standard of the culture, because Malacca is the branch that retained Baba Malay, there are Peranakans all over this country. The three spots, or the three most famous Peranakans, the three most famous Peranakan locations are, of course, Malacca, Penang, and Singapore, because it is those places where the majority of the Peranakans live. They forget, of course, that there are Babas in PJ, like myself, a PJ Baba with basically Chinese gangster characteristics. There are Babas in Kelantan and Terengganu. Professor Teo Kok Siong is a Kelantan Baba, and his language is basically a hybrid language of Hokkien and Malay. And well, the reason why Terengganu and Kelantan Babas and Nyonyas are less well known than the Malacca, Penang and Singapore ones, I believe because the Malacca, Penang and Singapore were fundamentally British controlled territories. So a lot of what we know about the Baba Nyonya culture comes from the anglicized Straits Chinese Baba Nyonya elites. Not every Straits Chinese is Peranakan, I just have to make that clear. But every Peranakan is Straits Chinese. And the most anglicized ones, yes, were in Penang, Malacca and Singapore. In fact, many of them even forgot how to speak Malay, or they spoke Malay at a half-baked rate because, why? They had assimilated so far into the Anglo-Saxon culture. And then what's worse is that somebody like Lim Boon Keng goes from being a complete Anglophile to being a complete Sinophile. To the extent that Lu Xun, the Chinese philosopher, even described him as a British subject who can't shut up about Confucius. Why, yeah, he went to China to actually debate with Lu Xun after mugging up on Mandarin. But the point is, the reason why Malacca, Penang and Singapore are the most well-known locations for the Baba Nyonyas is, I guess, because the anglicized Baba Nyonya has dominated the imagination of everyone on the Peranakans. But there is much to be learned, I believe, about the Kelantanese and the Terengganu Babas. So I highly recommend Professor Teo Kok Seong's book, which I am reading right now, about the Peranakans in Kelantan. I'm not an authority on Kelantan Peranakans because I've only visited Terengganu once, but never Kelantan. But yeah, I might pay Kelantan a visit someday. The point is, the Peranakan culture didn't die in Kelantan or Terengganu. It's not getting suffocated and Mandarinized as it is in Singapore. Which shows you that historically, Baba Nyonyas and Malays have had a very good relationship. Even today, Chinese New Year is celebrated by Terengganu Peranakans who invite their Malay neighbors to their house for halal Chinese New Year feasts. So clearly, they have retained elements of their Chinese culture, but they have stopped referring to themselves as Han Chinese. Why would they? Because China is a distant memory from centuries ago. So how did it occur that there are Malacca, Penang and Singapore Babas? Well, this is because although historically all of them come from the same root, which is Malacca, there was not as much opportunity in Malacca as there was in Penang and Singapore. Because when Francis Light opened up Singapore in the late 1700s, you had Malacca Babas moving up north to Penang in order to better their living conditions. Now, as you know, Penang is a Hokkien-dominated town. The Hokkiens are among the oldest Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. In fact, the Peranakans like Hokkiens because we see them as our ancestral cousins. We may not always speak Hokkien, but we have the most affinity with the Hokkien people because we see them as us 200 years ago. So what happened was in Penang there was a paucity of Nyonya women. So what did the Babas do? They married Siamese women and they married Hokkien women, the closest equivalent to a Nyonya. Because like I mentioned, Baba Malay is a combination between Malay and Hokkien. So over time, the Penang Babas gradually adopted Hokkien customs, adopted the Hokkien language. When I say Penang Baba, I'm not referring to a genetic blood contract, like I said. Because if you were born in Penang, a Baba who was born in Penang, but you moved to Malacca, you might not speak Hokkien, and you might speak Baba Malay instead. So anyway, the Penang Babas, I'm not referring to a genetic state of being, I'm referring to a cultural state. because we're all the same people and we all come from the same root. The Penang Babas, eventually, many of them ended up adopting Hokkien, and eventually Hokkien replaced Baba Malay as the language of the house. And before long, the master of the house found himself chanting funeral rituals in Hokkien. Yes, now that doesn't mean that I see those women as intruders, okay? Because Hokkien was not bureaucratically enforced like Mandarin. It came in naturally. It's not like how Lee Kuan Yew basically forced the Babas into the Chinese box and forced Mandarin on them whether they liked it or not. That's different. So I don't see those Hokkien women as intruders. In fact, I see them as spiritual Nyonyas, basically, because they came into our culture, they assimilated. Within a few generations, their children were still calling themselves Peranakan. However, the same cannot be said, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to target Chinese diaspora men, but the same cannot be said for many marriages that involve a Han Chinese man and a Nyonya woman. Because I was talking to a friend the other day, and she's actually half Nyonya on the mother's side and half Hakka on the father's side, just like Lee Kuan Yew. She doesn't have Lee Kuan Yew's values, but yeah. And I said to her, why don't you call yourself a Nyonya? You're technically one, right? She said, no, I just don't identify with the culture. And she said that you're a Baba, but I'm just Malaysian Chinese. So oftentimes, when a Han Chinese man marries a Nyonya woman, the Peranakan identity gets overridden, and eventually the children and the grandchildren end up just calling themselves Chinese. But you don't notice the opposite direction. When it comes to the opposite direction, when a Baba man marries a Singke woman, oftentimes the children still call themselves Peranakan because of our patriarchal society, right? So I'm not saying that Han Chinese men cannot marry Nyonyas. That would be very, very racist of me. But what I am saying is your children may or may not be Peranakan. It all depends on whether you allow the worldview to exist or you stifle the worldview, like Lim Boon Keng's father and grandfather. Eventually, Lim Boon Keng ends up bringing Chinese exams and Chinese homework for us when none of us asked for it, right? So it's not the same as the Chinese men who came as sailors in the 1700s or the 1600s, when they actually wanted to assimilate into the land. Now the dynamic is different because they didn't come as... Because back then, our ancestors came as poor and penniless Chinese sailors who wanted to belong. They didn't come as assimilationists. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, Peranakan is not a blood contract, and it's basically, it is whether you keep the Nusantara view, whether you still respect the Malay world, no matter what language you speak. Even if you don't speak any Malay and you speak Mandarin or Hokkien as your second language, doesn't matter. But we have to maintain civilizational boundaries, and one of these civilizational boundaries is it doesn't matter if you speak beautiful Malay like Lee Kuan Yew did. What matters is your ethics. What matters most is your allegiance. Do you consider yourself to be an overseas Chinese who dreams about China like Lim Boon Keng did? Or do you consider yourselves to be a son or daughter of Nusantara? So even if you don't speak any Malay, but you respect the Malay world and you consider yourself a son or daughter of Nusantara, well then, even if you don't have any Peranakan ancestry, you are spiritually Baba or Nyonya. The sweet Chinese grandmother, who never bullies or belittles anyone, unlike the Chinese ultras, is also spiritually Nyonya. And if her descendants end up marrying into Baba Nyonya families, why then their children will become Baba and Nyonya, you see? So it's not a blood contract, it's not something that your children cannot be. You may not be Peranakan, but if you are sincere your children can be, or they might not be. But yeah, so I hope this this video has fundamentally explained to you what a Peranakan is, and basically we get to the last and the most erratic group of Peranakans. Of all the groups of Baba Nyonyas, whether they be Penang, Malacca, Terengganu, Kelantan, or Singapore or Pahang, the Singaporean group, and I say this with no malice in my heart, is the most erratic group of Baba and Nyonya. And this is not just me talking off the top of my head. I have spoken to actual Singapore Babas and Nyonyas who describe the majority of their own compatriots as revisionist. Yes, Josephine Chia herself has said that many Singaporean Babas and Nyonyas deliberately downplay the Southeast Asian, the Nusantara side of their heritage, and deliberately assimilate themselves for Han Chinese respectability. Now, it doesn't matter if you can trace your bloodline back to the Malacca Sultanate, doesn't matter. But if you don't respect Nusantara and you look down on Malays, as many Singaporean Babas do, and Nyonyas as well, and you consider yourself to be a branch of the Chinese tree with pretty clothing and curry, then you have lost the mantle of Baba Nyonya. You are Baba Nyonya only technically, but like Lee Kuan Yew, not in spirit. Again, I'm not saying I'm going to impose a Malay language test on you, but you have to remember that Peranakan itself is a Malay word, and it means to be off the soil, not on the soil. So if fundamentally you're opening up boutique cafes and you're taking Malay food and rebranding it as Nyonya food and charging people 3 times the amount for it, and you're using your Peranakan heritage without the responsibility of representing the identity correctly and standing up for Peranakans who are being bullied for not being Chinese enough, you are only Baba or Nyonya technically, but not in spirit. And look, every civilization has boundaries. Even the Chinese diaspora have boundaries. For example, they will tell you that if you don't speak at least one Chinese dialect, you're not Chinese. Call yourself anything you want, but you're not really Chinese. Do I agree with this? Well, maybe not. However, still, I understand the need to draw civilizational boundaries, because if everybody gets to call themselves Chinese, why then Sapenza himself can start calling himself culturally Chinese as well. You see? So, the point is, every culture has boundaries, and boundaries are not drawn at blood but at behavior. So if you are basically, if you inherited the Peranakan culture but not the responsibility to defend the dignity and people of Nusantara, why then you're only a Peranakan technically, and you're basically a parasite who's basically profiting off your identity, but not basically serving as the moral class of people like Tan Cheng Lock, you know, people who actually defended the dignity of Nusantara and was comfortable and were comfortable in their own skin as Southeast Asians, and didn't try to re-sinicize themselves to make themselves more palatable to the Chinese. That's what we mean by being Peranakan. So I'm going to end my video right now, and I just want to say that this video is not meant to attack anyone. Of course, my enemies will try and reframe it as an attack on the Chinese community, but my definition of being Peranakan means somebody who is rooted in Nusantara, comfortable in his own Nusantaran skin, and doesn't feel any loss about not being Chinese enough. If you can do that, even if you are not Peranakan by blood, why then you're halfway on the way to becoming Peranakan. And, you know, I don't want to say that, you know, you can only become Peranakan. I don't want to say only that, you know, you need a Peranakan father for your children to become Peranakan. Some of the most pedantic gatekeepers actually insist that if your father is not a Baba, you are not a Baba as well. But I don't really agree with that personally. I mean, of course, if I agreed with that, that would suit me well, because, you know, that way I could actually gatekeep the culture from being hijacked by people like Lim Boon Keng. However, I don't want to punish decent, kind, and well-meaning Chinese men who want to actually respect the culture and the values of Nusantara, like my ancestor, who actually want to stay in Nusantara and love the soil like his own mother. I don't want to punish decent Chinese men, because I do believe there are many decent Chinese men who just want, you know, to assimilate and be rooted in this land, and are not Chinese ultras. So yes, the most pedantic gatekeepers will say that your father has to be Hokkien or Teochew, and preferably a Baba, but I'm actually quite welcoming to Hakkas, Cantonese, and Hokkchu men to marry into our families and raise Baba Nyonya children. Now, I know that you might not see many Peranakans with the surname of Ng or Leong, because those are not typical Peranakan surnames, because most people with a Sinke father don't tend to identify as Peranakan. But I would encourage you, you know, to embrace your Baba Nyonya identity. As I said, I prefer the Baba Nyonya term, right, over Peranakan. If you truly feel that you don't identify with the broader Chinese diaspora and their anxieties about being Chinese enough, and their hyper-competitive culture, and their very hierarchical bureaucratic worldview, I would encourage you to just identify as Baba or Nyonya. Like I said, blood is not a social contract. No, blood is not a contract, meaning that likewise, you don't have to identify as Peranakan if you don't want to, even if you're a full-blooded Malacca Baba who can trace his ancestry back to the time of Zheng He. You don't have to be Peranakan if you don't want to. I'm not locking you in. I don't tell you it's your obligation to your Baba Nyonya ancestors. I don't think like a Sinke extremist. But at the same time, I also don't think that Chinese diaspora people should be locked forever in the diaspora mode of existence. I also think that someday they, like the Hokkien ladies who married into Penang lines, should also be just as rooted as we are in Nusantara. And I also think that half Peranakans with a Chinese Han Chinese father should also have a right to call themselves Peranakan if they cannot identify with the Chinese diaspora culture or norms or values. Well, look, ultimately blood is not a contract. And even full Han Chinese people, like the Sinke bananas, I will say that you don't owe the Chinese ultras shit. If they try to shame you, if they try to bully you, if they try to belittle you for not being Chinese enough because you don't speak any Chinese, or you don't act Chinese, or you don't have as much passion as they do about preserving the Chinese identity in Malaysia, well then, you don't owe them shit either, okay? Just like my ancestor didn't owe China shit. You want to marry into a Baba Nyonya family, you want to raise Peranakan children, you want to laugh with us, dance with us, eat sambal with your hands, and have some joy in your life, and not have to be constantly vetted and graded and audited by imaginary frowning ancestors, because I don't think that the ancestors of the Chinese people actually care whether you uphold their norms and traditions or not, as long as you're happy, right? Tan Cheng Lok's ancestors will probably look at him and think, okay, this one's happy, leave him be. Ultimately, you don't owe the Chinese ultras shit either, just like my ancestor didn't owe China shit. So yeah, my final message to the Chinese ultras, the fascist Chinese ultras of Malaysia and Singapore, who try to police and control the Chinese community and who basically believe that they own the people of the Chinese community, your authority ended the moment your ancestors set foot in Nusantara. Assimilation into your culture is something no one owes you. Now, you don't owe me assimilation into my Baba Nyonya identity either. That's fine. But I just want to tell you that the Bananas, the Babas, the Nyonyas, we don't owe you shit, frankly. And yeah, I mean, Nusantara has room for everyone. It has room for all and sundry who adopt our values and our roots and our ways of life. It has room for everyone who adopts our values, our adat, budi and sopan, and our way of life. But ultimately, you have to actually want to belong, like my ancestors did. And I hope that by the subsequent generation after the next, I will still be alive to see the day when Baba and Singke distinctions vanish and all of us are Paranaka. But you can't paste the title on yourself if you don't identify with its values. You actually have to earn it. Meal by meal, step by step, like my ancestor did when he humbled himself and assimilated to this land, and he did not impose a Chinese exam on the land. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.